Okay, if everybody can find a comfy place to sit, we're ready to get started. And again, I'm able to hand over to one of my esteemed colleagues here. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Peter Phillips. And Peter is at the University of Saskatchewan in the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy. He's worked very closely with the Global Institute for Food Security, both in advising us on policy issues and also helping us an awful lot with our overall strategy. So Peter, will invite you onto the stage to host the rest of this session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. The topic is emerging technologies for global food security. There's two parts to that. One is we have to talk about the cutting edge of where technology is, where it might be, and where it's going over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, which is the window we do much of our planning on. And then we have to talk about the application of technology. So in a way, this conference embodies the two challenges of food security. Scientific knowledge and capacity is a necessary condition. I think that was a conclusion of all the panelists up there yesterday. Nobody was saying science isn't part of the food security solution. But it's only a necessary component. It's not sufficient. Most of the commentators yesterday and the panelists today will talk about what is needed to translate science from a good idea to an application that has technological merit and effect, and get it adapted and adopted and used in the global food system. So science is not sufficient. We need to talk about first where and how we will bring forward new, better, and more diverse technological capacities that will allow us to advance the productive capacity of agriculture. And we need to talk about where and how we can find stronger, more resilient, better coordinated, more responsive regulatory and market systems that will enable those technologies to go from good ideas to best practices and uptake and use and effect and impact in terms of food security. So this panel session addresses those two challenges. We have two speakers today. I'll introduce them in aggregate, then I'll commandeer them up and down the stage. Dr. Neil Gutterson is the Vice President of R&D with DuPont Pioneer, where he leads all of the R&D and development functions across the spectrum. And so it's everything from germplasm to breeding systems to biotechnology-derived solutions to the undiscussed so far, but increasingly important data analytics part of the breeding system. Before joining Pioneer, Neil was engaged in a variety of entrepreneurial startups and firms, including Advanced Genetic Systems, DNA Plant Technologies, and Mendel Biotech. He holds a BSc in chemistry from Yale, a PhD in biochem from UC Berkeley, and was a part of the Stanford Business School on Emerging Companies Executive Program as a postdoctoral training. He's an inventor on more than 30 patents, and he currently sits on the CIMMYT Board of Trustees. I regret to inform you, and I think you all got a little tiny sheet, but if you're like me, you might have had to take your glasses off to read it. Dame Ann Glover is unable to join us today. She sent her regrets late last week. She's had a death in the family and just was unable to attend and join us. So on short notice, we commandeered a colleague and a friend of mine from the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Stuart Smythe. He's an assistant professor in an industry-funded research chair in agri-food innovation at the University of Saskatchewan in the College of Agriculture and Bioresources. Stuart gave me one bio. I'm going to give you the bio I know as him as a human being and as a colleague and friend. He grew up on a mixed family farm in Saskatchewan, did a degree in political science, and practiced for an extended period of time as a consultant in the agri-food development space. He turned up at my door one time and said he wanted to return to university and do some graduate studies, and by the time we were done, we've spent 20-some years working together. He completed a PhD in an interdisciplinary program on biotech and society. For a period of time, he worked with AgWest Bio as a regulatory advisor and has been a research scientist and now is a tenure-track faculty in the Department of Agriculture and Bioresources Policy, Business, and AgAc. They have trouble figuring out what their name is sometimes. He's the co-lead with me on the social science component of the large-scale project that Jeffs has talked about a number of times already. He's the co-author and editor of an expanding and extensive library of journal articles and books on agri-food innovation, including most recently both a handbook and a research collection on agriculture, biotechnology, and development with Edward Elgar. They're large enough that you could use one on each side as a weight lift, an exercise machine. So today we have the two speakers. They're bookending the debate. At one level, the cutting edge of where people think technology may be coming, and as I understand, I haven't received my Economist yet this week, but people tell me the current issue of The Economist is full of stories about agriculture, and CRISPR-Cas is one of the technologies that people are focusing on as cutting edge. And at the other end of the spectrum, we'll listen to Stuart talk about the regulatory regimes. So with that, let me invite Neil to join the podium.
Thanks very much. And thanks very much for the introduction, and to Morris for the invitation to come and share with you something of what we're doing at DuPont Pioneer and DuPont more broadly. What I want to do then is actually spend the first maybe third or so of my remarks about food security broadly and what we're doing to understand the issues of food security and the support that we have for the Economist Intelligence Unit in delivering the Global Food Security Index on an annual basis. So I'll talk a bit about some of the learnings that come out of the work we've done with The Economist on that. And then I want to talk about some of the work we're doing in, as was mentioned, CRISPR-Cas advanced breeding as a way to bring more quickly some really important innovations that we think have a real strong potential to impact the developing world. And of course, that will depend upon the uptake of the technology, but it's a technology, this sort of novel ways to breed through genome editing that we think can be broadly used in a wide range of crops, and I want to give you an introduction to what we're starting to do and where we think we can go with that technology. So with that in mind, so I think everyone knows who DuPont Pioneer is. We work globally. We are the world's leading developer and supplier of advanced plant genetics. And we also are very strongly committed to providing services to our customers for the 90 years that we've been in business. And so genetics is a key piece from Pioneer. In the DuPont landscape, our crop protection colleagues also deliver crop protection solutions to help our customers get to the maximum productivity and profitability from their farms. And as was mentioned also, we are more and more bringing data behind the services we deliver to growers to help them better understand what to plant on their fields, when to plant it, and how to manage it. And we think the opportunity in data is a really big one. So we're involved in innovation, science-driven innovation company for the long term. And we believe that mix of technologies is really critical to helping to feed the world, both in the developing world and in the mission that we're talking about here today, the developed world and the developing world. Certainly, there's a lot of science that's needed to feed the world. We work in creating what you might think of as global assets, our germplasm, our traits, the chemical crop protection products that we develop. But we know absolutely that the solutions are local, and how we bring together those products in packages that can enable growers to have not just solutions to challenges from pests and pathogens, but durable solutions to those challenges is part of what we focus on. We know collaboration is critical. We collaborate very broadly. I'll touch upon that theme a bit again when we talk about genome editing and CRISPR-Cas advanced breeding. We know that science must be adopted locally and used locally and interact with what is understood at the local level, and that our solutions must be sustainable, not just because they're durable products, but also because they help farmers do a better job in producing with fewer inputs. And that is a key part of our mission as well. So what are some of the food security issues? And this is a topic, I don't have to dwell on it, but just to remind you, We all know that the challenges of population growth, climate change, impacts on soil globally, the yield challenges we have with breeding. And key to that, as I said a moment ago, are collaborations. And certainly across all the technologies we deploy, we work very closely with farmers, continually with civil society, with government, with NGOs. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit more when I get to the end of the discussion about advanced breeding through CRISPR-Cas. And of course, innovations are critical. And getting innovations deployed, the theme here, from where I've sat in the CIMMYT board for the last 3 years, is really not just about technology, but about innovations in infrastructure and in seed production systems. We know that complex technology is difficult to adopt, and technology needs to be fairly simple to be taken up broadly, especially in the developing world where there's usually less infrastructure to support that technology. So what are our food security goals? We announced, I think it was about 4 years ago now, that by the end of 2020, we would help the world meet the challenge of achieving global food security in 3 important ways. One is investing into innovation to feed the world, and I'll touch on that in a moment. The second is engaging and educating youth, both understanding the technologies that are important to the future and bringing the youth into the mission of feeding the world is part of what we're focusing on. And then lastly, it's critical if we're going to be successful that we don't just deliver products to the developed world customers, but to customers in the developing world, very different sort of customer base, not thousands of acres, but single digits of acres in many cases. And so focusing on smallholder livelihoods, on rural communities is part of what we do by engaging with, in our own markets in some regions, in India and Africa, but also with partners through NGOs and international ag organizations. So where are we on that path to supporting food security? So the top 2 pie charts show our progress in the first 3 years on innovation investment. Our commitment was to invest $10 billion in R&D, and you can see we're on track to deliver against that goal. We've already invested nearly $4 billion of that $10 billion in the first 3 years towards our commitment. Ultimately, it's not about what you invest, it's about what the outcomes are, and it's about the products that we're developing. We had a commitment to deliver a certain number of products, 4,000 products, and we're well ahead of pace to deliver those products into the market to support this mission. Come to the bottom on the left side, youth engagement is an important principle for us. And we've worked very broadly with communities in that way. We've worked with, for example, in the Ukraine, with ag students, focusing on some of the challenges in those local regions. And we've also reached down to lower levels, and we've worked with 3rd and 4th grade students in Brazil, looking at sustainability of agricultural systems. So we're deeply engaged in those processes, and you can see that we already exceeded that 2 million target of engaging youth, but we will continue to do that sort of work. And then the last point, in terms of smallholders and rural development, we have a target of impacting the livelihoods of 3 million smallholder farmers. We've achieved about, a fifth of that so far. So there's a ways to go on delivering that. The number of ways we do that, and one example is work we do in India. We've established a rice farm, for example, to reach out to smallholder growers in the province of Uttar Pradesh. So let me now talk a little bit about work we do, as I mentioned, partnering with the Economist to deliver a global food security index. And we do this annually. The 2016 edition of the index just was published last Thursday. So I encourage you to go to the website. You can see on the slide to check that out. There's an entire Excel spreadsheet of data behind it, and then there's a nice report that is delivered. We think this is a unique set of information. Clearly, if we're going to impact the mission, we have to measure where we are and where we're going. If you don't measure an outcome, you can't really improve it. And so there's quarterly adjustments made to that index. We release it on an annual basis, and there are some unique quality indicators in there to help us really understand, country by country, some of the issues that underlie challenges of food security. And so what we're really after are, what are some of the root causes that limit progress against food security? And so we do there's 113 countries in that food security index, and we hope that by providing understanding to those countries, that in some cases, countries can perhaps lift themselves up by better understanding what the challenges are and what other countries are doing to improve global food security or food security in that region. So what have we learned? Five key trends are highlighted here. The first is that most progress, or the best progress, is made in upper middle income countries. The next level would be in some of the lower middle income countries. Obviously, as you go down that income level, the challenges get steeper. What we have seen, though, is that the average share of household spending against food across countries in the index has dropped by 11% in this 4-year period, and that's a key part of progress. We know that the developing world spends a much higher percentage against food to deliver their local food security than the developed world does in general. We also know that we've learned that the challenge of elevating food security locally is really impacted by the rapid urbanization that's going on around the world. And so we can begin to then look at those issues and look at how we can overcome some of those challenges driven by urbanization that's happening around the world. The fourth point is that while almost 70% of the countries in the index have identified and developed nutritional standards, that means that over 30% still have not developed simple nutritional standards and then applied that through school systems that would help them lift food security in their regions. And so we hope, again, the last point is that this kind of information provides a valuable insight to developing countries, that they can learn from the diversity of solutions in other regions and deliver more diversity in diets and improve food security in their regions. So finally, in terms of what we've learned, there's a number of points to be made on this slide. This is the overall score, and you can see the index on the left. The overall score across countries around the world. And no surprises here where food security is challenged the most. You can see across much of Africa, in parts of Asia, and parts of Latin America. But overall, we have seen improvement in overall global food security. In 2015 to 16, there have been some declines in terms of use of standards for food security that we've seen. We also know that food security is improved when solutions are simple, and I mentioned that earlier. We've learned, obviously, I think many of us, that complex solutions are difficult to adopt. And so even simple solutions like improved storage post-harvest, improved transport infrastructure, make an enormous impact on local food security. And that brings me then to some of the things that we're doing, because if we're going to make an impact, it has to be through relatively simple solutions. And as I'll come to, CRISPR-Cas advanced breeding delivers options for growers around the world, for farmers around the world, that are very simple, we believe, to adopt. So this picture just is to introduce sort of some of the technology history behind a company like DuPont Pioneer. Our foundation is in the first revolution of crop improvement in the 20th century, which was the development of hybrid systems as applied to corn. And the yield had been pretty much stable in the United States until hybrid systems were really improved. And over the last 60, 70 years, the last 90 years, we have continually seen better gains in yield for our customers through hybrid systems that we continue to deploy in a wider range of crops. So not just corn, but in rice, in canola, and in other crops. Obviously, ag biotech was another important revolution. We bring ag biotech traits to the market, and that's part of the foundation of crop improvement for the future, along with hybrid systems. And now we've recognized that there's a new opportunity that we believe in very strongly, has a potential to be a similar revolution to what we saw from ag biotech and hybridization. And so we have begun to invest significantly in the technology, in the IP that's necessary to practice the technology. And we've gotten here because we've spent the last 90 years investing in the understanding of the genomes of the crops we work in, and without that deep understanding and the sequence knowledge about the genomes we work on, we can't apply CRISPR-Cas very effectively. We've also invested significantly in the ability to transform crops, to introduce molecules into plants and to modify the genomes of those plants. And that combination of CRISPR-Cas, of genomic understanding, and the ability to deliver molecules into a plant cell, that set of three tools are critical to our ability to deliver CRISPR-Cas advanced breeding on top of the platform of conventional breeding systems. So many of you may be familiar with this, but I just wanted to spend a couple of slides at least introducing what we mean by CRISPR-Cas and what it is and what it can do. So CRISPR-Cas is a system that was derived from microbes to enable them for an adaptive immunity system to virus infection. But we've taken a nuclease, the Cas9 nuclease, from that system and deployed it in a way that can enable us to edit any genome. And so this nuclease actually can cut, there's two nuclease domains, can cut in double-stranded fashion, can cut double-stranded DNA in a clean fashion. And the way that process works is that the nuclease is guided to a particular target in the genome by a very simple guide RNA. Earlier tools for genome editing all required the editing of a nuclease in order to be effective. And that protein engineering was a relatively slow, cumbersome, expensive process. But if all you have to do is synthesize a new RNA molecule to target the genome by just binding to an existing nuclease, that dramatically changes the challenge of targeting any location in the genome. And so CRISPR-Cas has really changed the interest level and the ability of many industries to impact genomes of organisms that are important to them. So once the nuclease cuts, then the cell tries to repair that cut, and that can lead to small mutations. But if we actually use templates, we can actually repair the DNA in a way that we can design the changes we make. And so one of the things we can do with CRISPR-Cas is to create a deletion, either by making a single cut, or potentially, and I'll talk about this in a moment with the example I'll give you, making two cuts near each other, and by design, deleting a particularly targeted piece of DNA to create a desired outcome. So deletion is a very simple thing to do, just relies on the cell healing those breaks. But we can also either edit or move sequences, and that's driven by a template. So after we cut the DNA, we introduce a template, and that template can have a small change in it, maybe just a couple of base pairs, that enables a minor change in the protein that's produced. For example, maybe taking a resistance gene and making it that maybe has lost the ability to provide resistance to a crop and making it resistant again, or the idea of moving a gene within the genome. And so one of the important principles here is that we are working entirely within the genome and the gene pool of a given crop of interest. And so the example here, for example, might be that we take a disease resistance gene from one variety of corn or wheat and move it into another variety of corn or wheat, into its normal location. Something we can actually achieve through breeding, but we can do it much faster potentially with this technology. So I've talked to you about this technology, CRISPR-Cas advanced breeding, and we see it as evidently a breeding technology. It's part of our integrated breeding systems that we're developing and we continue to develop. And there are three examples here that highlights why we see it that way. And the point is that the changes that happen through evolution naturally and the changes that we get in our variety development processes through breeding are the same sorts of changes that we can deliver working within the crop system with CRISPR-Cas technology. So on the left, you can see an example in tomato from 2008, where we came to understand that a gene duplication was behind change in expression that led to elongated fruit in tomato. Just one example of a very simple sort of change that we could do with CRISPR-Cas happens in nature. If you look at the level of our knowledge about the maize genome, which has exploded over the last 5 to 10 years, if you just look at two well-known varieties, B73 and Missouri 17, and compare them, there are hundreds of copy number variants. There are thousands of presence-absence variants, places in the genome where in one variety the gene doesn't exist, in another variety it does exist. And you can see exactly where that gene would be in the other variety. And many, many indels, insertions or deletions, and small nucleotide changes, SNPs. We also know that every time we grow plants in the field that a certain number of SNPs, again, single nucleotide polymorphisms, are introduced per generation. So small single base pair changes happen all the time. We use them in breeding. And so again, whether we're inserting a gene from one variety to another, which happens in nature, this is all within the province of the types of changes we can deliver through breeding. So to drive that point home, why is it important that we have a technology that helps us not just deliver specific traits, but actually improve our breeding systems? So all the time, we have elite germplasm that we're adapting to local regions. We have global systems, but local adaptation. And so this example shows one in which we have an elite variety on the bottom left. It's got great agronomics for that region, but it's not tolerant to a particular stress that we care about. And so we may have a variety, and this is often the case, that's got really good resistance to that stress, but is very poorly adapted for that region. And so it normally would take us many cycles of back crossing, as you can see here, to get to a point where the amount of the original source of that resistance gene is so low that it doesn't impact the product we want to deliver, which is the elite variety. And here it shows 3% is left. Well, you can go a couple more cycles and get that down to less than 1%. But even that percentage has some baggage and can actually impact the performance of that variety. In contrast, what we can do with CRISPR-Cas, if we isolate the gene that delivers that stress, is in one step simply move that gene from the one variety into the variety with good agronomics, with elite performance. And so rather than many cycles, we can bring that down to just 1 or 2 cycles. Now we can move corn cycles pretty quickly. But if you think about this in the context that we are looking at many, many different traits we want to combine, if we've got 2 or 3 desired changes we want to bring in at one time, say resistance to a viral disease in Africa requires 2 or 3 genes, then the process to deliver that through CRISPR-Cas is tremendously shorter than the process to deliver that through conventional breeding. And so we think this has a phenomenal opportunity to impact not just what we do serving our customers, but with what all ag organizations do globally who serve their customers through breeding and release varieties through, say, national organizations. So, as I said, we think this is very broadly applicable. On the left, you can see that we're working on this in a wide range of crops today. Every crop on this list is a crop that we either are shortly going to work on or are already doing work in our labs. I'll give you an example about corn and what we're starting to do to bring the technology to the market. But we see it impacting all those traits on the upper right. So yield, disease resistance, drought tolerance are really important opportunities. We can increase nutritional value working within the genome of a crop. And for example, in a crop like soybean, we can improve the oil quality or the oil level or maybe the protein composition in a way that opens up some new market opportunities. And of course, we're using it already to improve our hybrid systems. And we see, as you can see here, that we're committed to bringing our first products, our first DuPont Pioneer branded products to the market in as early as 5 years. And I want to tell you that story because while the first product we're working on is not going to be an economic blockbuster for us, it's an important first step in bringing technology, working with the supply chain, working with our customers, helping them understand the technology in a very measured fashion. So our first product is going to be what we're calling the next generation Waxy corn. We basically looked at the different options we had, and this is one that we felt had many advantages as a first product. So first of all, it's a very familiar trait to the market. Waxy corn's been on the market excuse me, for many years. It's one we can generate through deletion technology. And so it's a way for us not only to get a first product introduced and understood, but also to perhaps get some understanding of how regulatory agencies and the public might look at this particular class of application of a deletion of a gene, right? No novel protein sequence at all. So the gene is also well understood. If you're going to use this technology, you need to know the exact gene you're going to target and what might happen when you delete that gene. And we know that the trait we deliver, and we know exactly how to work with that gene. There are many variants known in nature already. And the product is already identity preserved in the market. And so we can go at a relatively small market, deliver a new and improved version of Waxy, and give our customers choice, in fact. Right? They can use the conventional one or try the new and improved Waxy variety. And ultimately, the reason to do this is that the current varieties we deliver don't have the yield that we would want, and because of the time lag in bringing that trait into our elite varieties, genetics I showed you a moment ago, our products are not as high yielding as we'd like with this particular technology, with Waxy. So what is Waxy corn? It's a pretty simple concept. The Waxy gene is involved in the branching of amylose to amylopectin. And so what we end up with is, instead of conventional corn, where you have 3/4 amylopectin, the branch form, we end up with over 97% of branch chain starch molecules. And so you can see on the right the appearance of Waxy corn, where its name came from. The product, as I'll show you, has a number of uses, and again, very specific uses in the market. So Waxy corn starch, it has food industry uses. As you can see across the top, it's used in dough making, for example, as you can see on the far right. It also has industrial uses. And so it's a very common, impacts binding qualities and sometimes paper quality ultimately, as you can see in some of the pictures on the right there. And it has applications also in textile, in corrugated materials, and other adhesives. So it's broadly used in the market, a very specialty corn product, and it's identity preserved, and we can give customers an option and a chance to understand the technology as we bring it to the market. So what is this new and improved Waxy going to look like? First of all, the current Waxy product is derived from a 100-year-old corn variety when these Waxy variants were first studied. That current product has a non-functional Waxy gene. And as I mentioned before, the challenges include the fact that there's some yield penalty compared to our elite genetics in the products we bring to the market. And it also lags our elite genetics by 2 to 3 years at least. We know that in that variety, part of the Waxy gene is missing. The gene is non-functional. So the next generation Waxy product, using that model I introduced earlier, was instead of doing this back crossing, we go directly into one of our elite inbreds in the hybrid combination. Actually, we go into multiple inbreds because it's a recessive, and you have to engineer both of the parents of a hybrid. So this is actually facilitated as well by this direct transformation process, this direct process of modifying with CRISPR-Cas. And we can delete out the entire gene, which is what we've done. And we've brought this in the United States to the USDA. We have a letter from them in terms of how they're going to treat the technology. And now we're working around the world to help regulators understand this first product that we're bringing forward with an entire Waxy gene missing. The properties, other than the yield benefit for our customers, are identical to the conventional Waxy product. So we know that any technology, any new technology, needs to be understood by the public if it's going to be adopted well. And so we believe really strongly in working across a number of groups that are important to understanding the technology and to public acceptance of the technology. It's not just about the regulatory paradigm that we're going to find around the world. The easiest regulatory paradigm is not very useful if the public is resistant to the technology for whatever reason. And so you can see here a number of efforts that we're involved in. So we're at scientific meetings like this to talk about the technology, its value, and its safety. We're working with academics in a wide range of institutions already who we're talking about opportunities to collaborate and partner. We're working with regulators around the world to help them understand broadly the technology, but in general, they want to see an example. And so Waxy is our first product, but there are others we're talking about with them. We're talking to the media. We're working with commodity groups as we began the process of developing the Waxy variety and bringing to the USDA that product that we want to bring forward and getting their opinion on it. We had conversations with the value chain, the millers who will use the technology, to make sure they understand the technology, what it's going to do for their customers, and just developing that relationship with them as we go forward. We're working with international NGOs. On a consistent and regular basis, we're talking to international ag organizations within the CG system. So working with all the voices that we think are important and listening to people. Our first mission is really to understand much more than it is to be understood about what we're doing and understand their concerns, their issues, how they think about this technology, how they think about any technology that might be new, and how it impacts their thinking about food. We've learned that Food is not like a cell phone, and people's reaction to technology and food is not the same as it is when they get their new edition of iPhone or Galaxy, to be fair to all parties there. So, just to bring this to a close then, this slide really is a reminder of the work that we're doing in helping to deliver some solutions to the developing world. We have a number of collaborations with CG centers, formal and informal. This is an example for biofortified sorghum through transgenics in Africa, a wonderful product that increases vitamin C and other micronutrients. But the points here, and to summarize, are really clear. Food security is a global challenge. We all understand that. We have to address it at a local level. We have to understand through something like our Food Security Index what the issues really are at the local level. And those challenges are very much part of the mission that we feel at DuPont Pioneer. We know that we have a mission with our stakeholders, our customers, but we recognize when we bring technology forward that can impact the developing world, that we have another mission to help do that. And to do that, next second point really is that collaboration is the key. And especially with new technologies like this, we are looking actively to collaborate with all the sorts of groups I mentioned on the prior slide. International ag organizations, academics, small companies that might want to begin to use the technology to create products for the market. And perhaps lastly, we really do believe that simpler technology is easier to bring to the market and easier to bring to the developing world. The products we develop through CRISPR-Cas advanced breeding are going to look and feel exactly like what farmers around the world are used to getting through breeding. And so whether CIMMYT delivers a future product that's got resistance to important pathogens in wheat, or IRRI does the same in rice, to accelerate their breeding and deliver for those customers, this solution is a simple solution that we believe can be adopted in all the important crops. And of course, in some crops, it's even more valuable than others. When you have a complex crop like wheat, for example, a hexaploid, to do the breeding or engineering is even more complicated. And this technology will help accelerate that process, but still deliver a very simple solution, a simple outcome to customers. So we're looking to facilitate the adoption of the technology by colleagues around the world, helping them with whatever expertise that we're developing, and maybe even designing some of the projects that I think will be beneficial, and we're engaged in those kinds of conversations today. So that's the story, that's what we're doing. That's why we think CRISPR-Cas advanced breeding is part of the solution for global food security, as well as an important tool for our business. So thanks for your attention, and happy to take a few questions.
Me? Thank you. Very wonderful talk. I want to ask, is the off-targeting effect of the CRISPR is a problem or not?
So the question about off-targeting. So we know that when you target when you target a location, right, if the sequence somewhere else is similar, you could actually end up with making a change at that other location. 2 points I'd make about that. The first is that we are improving the specificity and working on that side of the story as we go forward. And we ultimately think that's going to be a pretty minor issue, to be honest. Of course, we can also know where those locations might be and verify that changes haven't occurred as well. So I think while that is an issue, to be thought about, and we take that very seriously, that in the long term, the technology will be sufficient to deliver absolutely precise changes without off-target changes.
So, Neil, my question was about the IP. So, here.
Oh, sorry.
Right here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry.
My question is about the IP because having just followed this in the popular press, there seems to be competing groups, for the technology, and yet you're obviously making a major investment, so you must feel like you have freedom to operate. So, what's the current IP situation in relation to this technology?
It's complicated. That's the situation. So, I'm not going to talk too much about the actual pieces, but you're right. This is a complex technology, and interference has been declared in the U.S. for 2 of those, the patents coming out of UC Berkeley and the Broad Institute. We're working to create for ourselves freedom to operate, and there's a lot of uncertainty. But we also know that the core technology, right, about CRISPR-Cas, I mean, there's many ways to get there, and I suspect there's not going to be just one simple, dominant position. There may be other sprouts that come up that offer alternatives, or as we improve technologies, that there may be a sort of really critical tool that becomes, sort of a linchpin in sort of the process. So there's uncertainty, we recognize that, but we think we can get there, and that the value justifies the risk we currently face, right? Which is, is true.
Hi. So for the last 20 years or so, agrobacterium has been the major workhorse for genetic engineering. Does CRISPR-Cas have the potential to actually completely replace that? Because you did mention about being able to make 2 edits and replace the sequence with a template. If you can shuttle in any desired gene into that location, isn't that better than the more sort of accidental nature of agrobacterium?
Right. So I think the point is that if you could target a location rather than random delivery through agrobacterium or other means, that has advantages. So, CRISPR-Cas is a tool, and mostly what we talked about today was our application for advanced breeding. But you're right, it is also a tool that can be used to improve transgenesis. And I think there are advantages to that. We are working with that technology as well and designing, landing pads in the genome, which we can verify as to, what impact you have when you put a gene there. So I think there will be advantages to that in the long term. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, there's been some people have raised that some of those groups that oppose GMO technology might equally oppose CRISPR and other new breeding technologies. Have you got any sense of, notwithstanding it may not make scientific or common sense, but you got any sense of how that might unfold, the same kind of brouhaha that we had over the GMOs?
Yeah, I mean, there are groups in the business of opposing technology, right? So I'm sure they'll be opposing, and we've seen things, right? So there's letters published about the technology from groups in Europe and elsewhere. We're trying to learn from, what happened in the last sort of biotech enabled revolution, ag biotech. And I think one of the lessons is talk, be transparent, understand people. And I think, we're really trying to get out very much ahead of that conversation. And I think part of it is that this is a technology that can be broadly used, right? This isn't just something that we want to bring forward and penetrate the market with. I think we're going to see lots of people use the technology. I think that may change the discussion. But, there's certainly risk of, the dialogue going in a way that might not be productive.
Final question over there.
So could you comment on the logic or the decision-making process that you used for pursuing a complete delete of the Waxy gene as opposed to a SNP-based gene inactivation?
I probably could. Maybe we can discuss it a little more offline. I mean, I think the simple story is that if there's some sensitivity perhaps to, if you make a mutation, what happens to the protein? Does it get degraded? Is it a different protein? You get away from all those issues if you just do a deletion. Of course, Waxy itself, the normal variant, is, it's a small deletion itself. And so we just felt that was a much more straightforward way to deliver a product. But
So do you think it's easier to get through the regulatory system by doing completely as a SNP-based inactivation?
I don't want to get too much into the minds of the regulatory agencies, and maybe we can discuss that offline a bit. Okay.
On that note,
All right.
I'd like to thank Neil for his talk. And that question is a perfect segue to the next talk by Stuart Smythe, who will talk about the regulatory system and how it has or has not handled new technologies.
Well, thank you very much, especially to Morris for the invitation. I'm certainly disappointed that Dame Ann Glover can't be here today, so you're going to have to put up with that, damn Stuart Smythe. So Neil's talk was a really good segue into what I want to talk about. And in fact, about an hour ago, I got an email from the journal Trends in Biotechnology. We had an article published today. Peter is co-author on that, along with another colleague of ours in my department. And poignantly, the title of the article is EU Failing FAO Challenge to Improve Global Food Security. So talk about a timely publication to come out today in Trends in Biotech. Hits exactly on what I'm going to talk to you for the next little bit about. So how do we remove politics, and particularly the politics within the European Union, from the approval of crop varieties and international trade? So I'm sure you've all seen this. Clive James and ISAAA puts this out, 28 countries around the world. But really what you can start to see is the gaps, right? We've got Venezuela and Peru as really the only two large countries in the Americas that have not adopted GM crops. But then you start looking at the map of Africa, or the Middle East, or parts of Asia. So that where most of these 2 billion people that are micronutrient deficient are living is where the tan colors appear on the map. So we've got a massive gap in the adoption of technology where food security is most important. So we've done a fair bit of work over the last 3 or 4 years looking at the global impacts of GM crops. I thought I'd share with you the 4 main crop varieties and give you a sense as to where the distribution of benefits are falling. You can see that as technologies move more into the developing countries, the share of benefits massively shifts to farmers growing the crops. Canola, soybeans, corn, predominantly industrialized crops, but corn's moving more into Africa, and particularly the adoption of cotton in India, China, and parts of Africa. You can see that 3/4 of the benefits are accruing to those adopting and planting the technology on an annual basis. Colleagues of ours in Davis have estimated that the global benefits a couple of years ago hit $46 billion. And Brooks and Barfoot put their annual report out about 2 weeks ago based on the 2014 production of GM crops, and they've estimated now that cumulatively over 18 years, we've now reached $150 billion in benefits. A staggering amount. And if you think that maybe half or 3/4 of that is now starting to go to farmers adopting this technology, well, that's a massive contribution to the economic well-being of farmers around the world. So what are some of the impacts from GM crops? Because we've been growing these crops for 20 years in North America now, that gives us the advantage to do some time-sensitive studies. Janet Carpenter a few years ago looked at 168 different studies comparing, looking at GM crop yields. So you can see about 70% of the reports that she found showed yield increases, 20% sort of consistent with what was being used previously, and about slightly under 10% saying that GM crops had a lower yield. Robert Finger then 5 years ago looked at 203 studies concluding that there was no substantial yield boost from a genetically modified crop, but there was a substantial benefit of reduced pest and insect populations allowing yield increases. Rob Ariel looked at 97 studies looking directly at studies that compared GM yields to non-GM yields, finding GM outperformed in developing and developed countries. And then Matan Kaim looked at, made a study of 147, finding that chemical uses dropped by over 1/3. Yields are up by 20%. But I think substantially, farm profits are up by almost 70% at a global level. And one of the basic tenets of the research we're doing is that food security is based on households having the resources to purchase food when it's needed. So if those farm profits hadn't increased by 68%, those households would have that much less capital or revenue to buy food on a daily basis. So to break this down a little bit into sort of what are the economic and the environmental and health benefits of GM crops, Matan Kaim, I think probably in one of the studies that's the most important to me, showed from BT cotton adoption, FAO classifies vulnerable households as those households that subsist on less than $2 a day. And he found that in India, households that had adopted GM cotton had increased by 134%. So we're talking about the most vulnerable in society, the most food insecure households. In India, we're having a substantial boost to their household incomes. Hutchison found then that GM corn, about 60% of the benefits spilled over to non-adopters because pest populations were dropping for the farmers that were growing BT corn, and the lower populations also benefited the farmers in the areas that are around those fields that had not adopted BT corn. So a substantial spillover of benefits. Some work that we did here with a graduate student 5 years ago estimated that the economic benefit of herbicide-tolerant canola in Western Canada was about $350 to $400 million a year. Melinda Smale found that GM corn adoption in the Philippines increased household incomes from $400 to $600 a year. And a little addition to that is that some of the households were able to free up the amount of time they had to spend working in their cornfields, and that they could get off the farm jobs to supplement their incomes even further. Jeff Vitale found that in Burkina Faso, conventional cotton produces a profit of about $70 a hectare, and GM bumped that up to $150. I think one of the stories that really never gets mentioned in the popular media or in social media is from the environmental benefits of GM crops, the sustainability aspect. Kimes found that pesticide use just in India alone has dropped by 41%. Jitan Hun, from working in China with Carl Prey and some others at Berkeley and Davis, found that applications have dropped from 14 kilograms a hectare to 4. And if you extend that into the regions, non-BT cotton fields have dropped the application by 75%. So that's and when we're talking about spraying in India and China, we're not talking about high clearance, high capacity sprayers that we see. We're talking about people walking through a cotton field with shorts and a t-shirt and a backpack sprayer, and probably somewhat limited access to water, so if they get chemical residues on their arms or legs, the ability to wash that off by the time they finish that field is not great. We had estimated that the environmental impact quotient of canola in Western Canada to drop by 53% after 10 years of GM canola use in Western Canada. Brooks and Barfoot showed that the reduction in carbon emissions is equivalent to 10 million vehicles being removed for an entire year. And one story that never gets mentioned is the health benefits. And I think this is an absolute travesty that social media and those that are critical of biotech will simply won't talk about, but I think is one of the reasons that I so strongly support this technology, is that the health impacts are probably the most important thing in why developing countries should have better access to these technologies. Guillaume Guerre and Deb Sengupta did a study looking at the adoption of BT cotton, and they found that in 2003, when BT cotton is commercialized, the suicide rate in Indian farmers plateaus. They projected and extended the rate of suicide at that point in time and extended it out to 2011, and they found that had BT cotton not been commercialized, the suicide rate would have been 1/3 higher than what it was. And environmental groups still, Vandiva Shiva still says that BT cotton kills Indian farmers, causes them to commit suicide. These results have been out for 5 years, and they still perpetuate this lie. Jennifer mentioned last night, our friend Martin Gauss found that hand weeding done by females results in 10 to 12 fewer days per season. So they get 2 crops in South Africa. That's 3 weeks less labor, back-breaking work done in the hot sun. IFPRI defines this as drudgery. So it's not like we go out and do a bit of weeding in our garden for a few minutes after work. having to have 3 weeks additional time that you can spend with your kids or hauling more water to your vegetable garden, those are substantial impacts that simply don't get mentioned. And I think then probably most importantly, the reduction in the cases of pesticide poisonings. Jeff Vitale's estimated that there's 30,000 fewer cases in Burkina Faso alone. Matankheim estimates this could be anywhere from 2.5 to 9 million people. So for those of you not familiar with pesticide poisoning, when you get it, it's like a extremely, I guess the best way would be an extremely severe case of the flu. It knocks you on your ass for about 2 weeks. You're really incapable of getting out of bed. So if you're the person responsible for field management in many developing countries and you can't get out of bed for 2 weeks, what's going to happen to that crop? If you've got a cotton crop that needs to be sprayed every 3rd or 4th day because of boll weevils and you've now got pesticide poisoning, who's going to do that? Well, in some cases, it's the kids. So the 13 or 14-year-old child gets pesticide poisonings. That's a travesty against humanity, in my opinion. But, of course, the environmental groups fail to take that into account. Virtually every developing country has had one of, if not all 3 of these. So we've got an abundance of information. So why aren't these technologies getting through? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Our regulatory systems are not structured to take advantage of 20 years of, probably more, probably closer to 25 years of technology change. The regulatory systems that we have in North America were put together in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. That would be like saying that the regulation of the automotive industry should still rely on the Model T. Yet, clearly that's not the case. Yet we still have a regulatory system based on trying to regulate technologies that Neil was just talking about, based on technologies that were developed 30 years ago. And now our regulatory systems are part of corporate investment decision. BASF moved all of their R&D, over 800 jobs out of Europe. The European regulatory system's now been politicized. It's not about science. It's about political power of environmental groups and green parties to get control of environmental ministries and ag ministries to make sure that these technologies do not get commercialized, particularly in developing countries. And I think the really telling tale is the last bullet, that 20 years ago, 1/3 of global ag R&D was spent in Europe. And that was the point that GM crops were commercialized, and it's less than 10% today. They've lost over 1% of global ag R&D a year for the last 2 decades. That is a killing factor to innovation in agriculture in Europe, and I think it's going to start to spill over to other sectors of the European economy, that other sectors in the economy are going to say, why would we invest in Europe? They're not an innovative part of the globe anymore. So what are some of the challenges? Well, we've seen a variety or a multitude of trade agreements. We've got the Canada-Europe trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the EU and the US are currently undergoing the TTIP negotiations. There's been absolutely nothing about biotech, GM crops, or the challenges from those. The CETA agreement between us and Europe says that this is an issue that's got some challenges and is going to be subject to ongoing dialogue. Well, so clearly, Europe's not even willing to engage with Canada to address substantial regulatory and trade challenges. They say, it's something we need to talk further about. So 5 years go by, 10 years go by, 20 years go by, we still haven't resolved anything. Last year, the EU decided that since they had really lost control of the ability to actually approve any GM crops within the EU, they would now allow member states to decide this back at a state level. So immediately, 19 of the 28 member states of the EU opted to ban GM crops. And to some extent, I think their regulatory system in Europe is in gridlock. It struggles to approve varieties for import, but that's taking anywhere from 3 and 5 year delays. And there's varieties that have been in the system for over a decade that simply have not got through. I think one of the concerning things, and this really sort of bridges to one of the questions that Neil had, This is now a hugely contentious political issue within the EU. You can see that January of last year, a collection of leading environmental groups have started to lobby the Commission to make sure that GM or new breeding techniques are banned within the EU. And here's the takeaway message. They want to make sure that none of these technologies are treated as conventional agriculture. They want to make sure every single one of them is listed as genetic modification and biotechnology. And they will ban the import of those crops if they can't detect them. I was at a conference in Amsterdam last fall talking to a regulator from Germany about how to regulate these new plant breeding techniques. And I said, so what are you going to do if Canada adopts one of these new technologies to develop new varieties of canola? You receive a shipment and you can't tell what technology was used to create that variety of canola. She looked at me and she said, you know what the answer is. I said, your only option, your default setting is to reject. She said, absolutely. They will reject every technology, every crop variety that they do not, with 100% certainty, know what technology created that variety. This is a huge concern for global agriculture moving forward. So, one of the areas that I love to work in is looking at socioeconomic considerations developed through the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. I largely love to work in it because it gives me the ability to interact online with the community that's so highly critical of biotech. So this was an international agreement that was a supplement to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It was largely driven by the EU, and it's now in about 170 countries. Argentina, Canada, and the US are 3 of the top 5 GM crop producing countries in the world, and we're not members to it. So that creates some challenges. This is Article 26. Most of the Convention on Biological Diversity is not very contentious. 90% of the global challenge relates to Article 26. There's a few things that are really coming into play. So this is a voluntary regulatory requirement. Yet right now there's an ongoing process to make sure, and the NGOs are pushing so hard to make this mandatory. They want to change the language of the protocol to say that developing countries must take socioeconomic issues into consideration. They want to make it a mandatory obligation for developing countries considering the adoption of GM crops. The language says they have to be consistent with existing international obligations, which all of these countries are signatories to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization uses a science-based definition of risk assessment. These countries want to reject the WTO classification of risk assessment, putting them in violation of the WTO. So they're breaking their obligations to existing international agreements. This one really gets them riled up when I raise the fact that you can only take a socioeconomic consideration under assessment if there's an impact arising from the commercialization of a GM crop in your country. There's been absolutely zero discussion about what would trigger a socioeconomic impact. None whatsoever. And then the last one is these can only be applied if they relate to conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So it's a very narrow and tight definition of what is a socioeconomic consideration. Well, let me show you what the Norwegian government thinks socioeconomic consideration should be. They've got a state department there called GNOC, and GNOC, funded by the Norwegian government, is one of the strongest advocates for socioeconomic considerations to kill innovation in developing countries. You can see these issues. In some cases, there isn't even any methodology developed that would be capable of doing this type of an assessment. If we had a methodology and we had data in Canada, it would probably take us 1.5 to 2 years to do this assessment. Developing countries would have to go out and gather the data. At a minimum, it would take 5 years to be able to do a single risk assessment in any one of these areas. In some cases, as I said, there's simply no methodology to even be able to understand what an impact would be at a developing country. So for example, labor. Well, we know there's a lot less people farming today than there was 30 years ago. Is that a benefit to our society? Or would that be viewed as a negative externality from modern agriculture? There's no response on that. So part of what we did is we said, well, how are these regulatory lags factoring into delays in innovation? So Phillips McDougall put out their study 5 years ago saying that it costs about $136 million to get global approval for a new GM crop. I extended that with a colleague of mine at IFPRI. So we sort of estimated this at different levels of return on investment, 20, 50, 75, and 100%. We discounted and said the technology would be good for about 10 years. So you can see here that at a 20% return on investment, the yellow line goes from positive to negative after a 2-year delay. When we up the investment to 100%, the private companies in this space can afford to go a little bit longer. But you can see at 3 years, they've, sort of moving from year 3 to 4, they lose half their potential ROI on investing in any new technology. By 7 years, it flattens out and it hits 0. So what's our concern about this? Well, in many developing countries, research is done by national ag research centers. And a 20% ROI is probably a pretty good return on their investment. So what happens now if new breeding techniques are classified as GM and they can't develop any new varieties because they're going to lose money on every single thing they develop? I think these environmental groups that are based and funded out of Europe, they don't want to stop biotech, they want to stop all ag research in developing countries. For example, they've pushed through a regulation in socioeconomics in Malawi's biosafety that said there can be no negative economic impacts, not one. So that means if somebody loses their job on a farm, that's a negative economic impact. Can you imagine where we would be with any other technology in our society? Where would we be with cell phones? Well, my goodness, somebody got killed crossing the street or texting while they were driving. I mean, how ludicrous is it to apply this type of a concept to food? So, the other strong message that gets sent to developing countries is in international trade and how the EU treats low-level presence and adventitious presence. In 2003, when EFSA was established, it coordinated all of this at the EU level. Prior to that, it had been at the member state level. And when adventitious presence, or LLP, was detected, trade still functioned. We've documented this in 5 or 6 cases where companies in Canada and the States had accidentally commingled GM with breeder's seed. They simply managed it, they contained it, they harvested it, burned it. But what they didn't do was they didn't close the border to international trade. And that's what the establishment of EFSA has resulted in at the European level. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In 2009, there was a little bit of GM flax detected in Belgium and Germany that originated from Canada. So what was the first thing that the EU did? They slammed the border shut to all flax exports from Canada. It cost the Canadian flax industry about $30 million. The EU cost their flax processing industry about 40 million euro, resulted in 600 job losses. We put a stewardship program in place that costs our farmers about $1 million a year. But the frustrating thing is there's absolutely no incentive to stop this stewardship program. The Canadian flax industry isn't going to voluntarily say, oh, we're stopping it. We think Europe's still going to import our flax if we don't test it. Europe's not going to turn around and say to Canada, well, yeah, we want you to stop that program because our consumers are so confident in the products you're exporting. this cost of $1 million a year is going to go on in perpetuity. There's absolutely no way any country that puts in a stewardship program to try and make sure that LLP and AP issues are minimized can ever get out of this trap. It's a continuous cycle of negative impacts for the exporters. The states have had this problem with Herculex corn. In 2000, a variety was submitted. It took 6 years just to get that variety through, and by then they'd already had follow-up technology with rootworm corn. The gluten feed market dropped by 30 to 40% for 3 years. When we look at LL601 rice, it cost Bayer over $2 billion, over 1,000 different lawsuits. And the last research that I've been able to find on this showed that about 4 years ago, rice exports to back to the EU were only about 40% of what they'd previously been. So even if you do have a trade disruption, you don't get back to that level of trade that pre-existed. So when we see industrial countries like Canada and the States struggling to export non-GM or GM-free products to the EU, that message gets really carried over to the developing countries. And I really love this quote by the EU ambassador to Kenya, blackmailing them, saying that if you adopt GM crops, it's going to be very difficult for you to export anything to Europe. Nothing like putting a gun to their head. So this last point that I want to bring up really strikes at the heart of how nefarious Europe is about this technology. So under the WTO, member countries are allowed to set a preferential tariff on products that are imported. And they can do this for individual countries and even individual products coming from a country. Yet, what Europe does is they say to developing countries, if you want this lower tariff rate for your product, you have to ratify and adopt the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which is the biggest barrier to innovation in agriculture in the developing world. It's based on the precautionary principle. So they're very, I would say it's a little bit unethical to put this type of a stipulation on a preferential trade agreement. So we're seeing that the Cartagena Protocol is a huge barrier to innovation. And they're going to lose market access if they adopt any GM crop. So what's the EU been saying about agriculture? Well, in 2013, UNCTAD put out its annual report, written predominantly by European authors, concluding at the bottom that food security in developing countries is going to rely on a return to largely organic, small-scale farming practices. I don't know. They've been doing that for 6,000 or 8,000 years, and they're asking for new technologies. I would think that they might be looking for something different than that. What else are they saying? Well, this has been in the news lately. The G7 group of countries struck up the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition to try and lift 50 million people out of poverty by 2050, and the EU Parliament calls it a mistake. And they're actually trying to encourage the G7 to move away from a commitment to GM crops. So, at a political level, we see the EU's rejecting science-based evidence that there's massive and substantial and ongoing benefits to GM crops in the developing world. They're intimidating countries to sign up and be part of the Cartagena Protocol, and they're blackmailing countries into not adopting GM crops. So, what can we do? How are we going to make sure that these countries have a chance to have some sovereignty for themselves to decide whether or not food security can be decided at a domestic level? Last year, the anti-biotech movement spent over $10 billion globally fighting biotech. The most recent numbers I have show that in 2011, the big 6 multinationals didn't even spend that much on ag R&D. So that shows you what a huge political this issue is at a global level. If they give an inch, they lose everything in the environmental space. This is going to be a fight to the death by the environmental groups. They will never concede a single benefit to biotech. So what do? Well, I propose there's 2 radical changes that need to be done. And now those of you that know me are probably thinking, oh shit, what's he going to say now? Well, the first one is we need to help developing countries opt out of the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. This is a killer of ag innovation, nothing more. This is stopping ag innovation at every single level in developing countries, and it will. I would call on environmental group or philanthropic organizations. They really need to step up and champion the benefits of biotech at the developing country level. Academics need to be better engaged to do studies of where adoption has taken place, to look at what the cost of not adopting BT cotton is in neighboring countries like Ghana, Chad, Togo. This research needs to be presented to parliamentarians and leaders of countries and key senior regulators so that they understand that not making a decision or making the decision to ban GM crops is going to be extremely costly when it is measured in terms of food security. The second one is we need to find a way to fence Europe out of global ag trade. All of the trade agreements that exist between developing countries and the EU need to be ended. We need to really push Canada, the States, and Australia to supplement these agreements, especially when it comes to products of new breeding techniques. Europe is going to reject every single one of those. And what developing country is going to be willing to use CRISPR to develop a new variety of sweet potato or ground nuts or bananas if they risk losing the entire EU market because they adopt that technology? Who does this and how? Well, I think federally in Canada and the States that our governments need to step up and make a stronger commitment and contribution to improving global food security, and that the philanthropic organizations need to partner with this. This research can then be done through peer review granting process to help these developing countries understand the cost of not adopting biotechnology and to develop a network of support to help them opt out of the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. We need to do a better job at lobbying our elected politicians. They need to understand that agriculture and global food security is the most important issue for our industrial economies in this day and age. The reality is if we're going to feed a world of 2050, we need to spend the next 10 years trying to deconstruct the barriers that have been put in place over the last 25 or 30 years that GM crops have been in existence. Science, as Neil has shown, I have no doubts that science can feed a world of 10 billion, 12 billion without any issue. The problem is we're not going to get them regulated and approved for use in the countries that need them the most. This is where our efforts need to be doubled up and refocused for the next decade if we have any hope of feeding a world in 2050. I'd like to thank the partners that fund my research. And if you're interested in following me on Twitter or my blog on Twitter, tune in for some controversy. Thank you.
One of the challenges at international events is sometimes getting people to come out of their shell and tell us what they really think. So maybe the questions can get Stuart to come out of his shell and tell us what he thinks. Biotech. There we go.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's very important what you have just raised. I have a question, perhaps on a more positive note. I don't know. But would you like to elaborate a bit further about off-patent? Because we know the first, at least one, if I'm not wrong, Monsanto's trade was actually went off patent 1 or 2 years ago. And what it will represent on the positive side, but also on the regulatory side, I mean, the challenges ahead. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. And if I want to take 1 minute again to your point about federal government, I just want to invite all of the presenters here, domestic and international participants, that there's an ongoing consultation right now, an international assistance review. And we are actually seeking, I'm actually working for Global Affairs Canada, the Food Security Division. So we're collecting views and inviting the public in Canada and abroad, as I said, about what the government should do in terms of, I mean, the whole assistance, the international assistance, but including particularly food security and agriculture internationally. So you just can Google Global Affairs Canada and you will find information about the consultation. Otherwise, you can talk to me later on. I can send you the information directly. So about off-patent, if you want to tell us more
Sure.
of your insights, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Several of the international partnerships, such as the WEMA project, for example, a lot of the intellectual property has been donated license-free, so there's no royalty requirements. I know that FAO had a discussion probably 8 or 10 years ago about establishing a revenue pool so that they could go out and purchase specific patents for developing country research that would really facilitate a variety development. So I think that sort of pushed some of the companies into donating more of their technology license-free or you know, donating it to these public-private partnerships in many countries. So I'm from the look or the view I've taken on it, I don't see patents as being a huge challenge for moving forward in this area.
If I just want to clarify, is that when they go off patent and they basically go to the public domain, the issue basically is who will pay for deregulating this in the EU or China. So the point is about, there is now an AG Accord, which I believe is in place until 2021, and after that is somehow unclear who will actually pay or eventually be committed or responsible for doing that, especially for markets like the EU that you referred to, that requires renewing the approval. So that's an issue that has to be addressed, and I have no idea about what could happen, but.
Yeah.
So thank you for your interesting talk, and very depressing it was too. So I'm not only English, but I'm a true European, and our problem happens to be that we haven't got a single scientist in government in the UK, and our EU agricultural minister was unable to differentiate between barley, wheat, rye, and oats. He just didn't know which was which. So we have a really depressing future unless some of us actually leave science and go into politics and try and influence GM in Europe.
I agree that the level of ignorance, not just in Europe, but North America too, at a political level is staggering. That too many people have been educated by social media about food and agriculture production.
Well, our government is rich in classically educated men, so much that one of them asked me what a molecule is and asked me, if I put a molecule in my drawer beside my bed at night, will it still be there in the morning? So how do you respond to that?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Yes, great presentation, Stuart. I really enjoyed it. Two things. In your recent publication, did you delve into the development of this political view in Europe to any degree that would give us more insight in, one, how it happened, and two, what to do with it? That's the first question. And secondly, I'm sure fellow politicians or ex-politicians like my colleagues here and others would suggest there are ways that you can take your message to cabinet caucuses or provincially and federally and other places to get the message, because you can influence politicians. And obviously they've been influenced in the wrong way in Europe. And when we were discussing things like the North American Free Trade Agreement here, we had people present cases for why there may be benefits and costs, and we could make that decision. But I'm sure the local government of Saskatchewan would have an ag caucus that would be very interested. And then that goes up to the cabinet committee and the same federally. And we need to arm our political leaders so that they can make appropriate companion policies, economic and political, along with the genetic, so we can actually be somewhat successful in providing food security. Because you're absolutely correct in my view. You will not have global food security without dealing with the socioeconomic and political conditions that are developed. So congratulations, a very, very good paper.
Thanks, Grant. I've talked to farmers here, and you know, when I ask the people that I grew up with and are friends with at farm, I say, you know, why did you adopt them? And their response was, I make more money per acre. I heard an African farmer at a conference about 4 or 5 years ago, and somebody asked him the same question, why did you adopt BT corn? And his response was, I make more money per acre. So if a farmer in Canada and a farmer in South Africa are adopting it because they make more money, I think we can present those numbers to government officials in all these countries saying, look, if you adopt this, your farmers are going to make more money. That's a benefit that works, it trickles its way up through the economy. And you know, when you have a drought, you're going to have to devote less money to buying food aid. So that, you know, investing $1 million in development of a new variety could save you $10 or $15 million down the road in having to purchase food aid. So laying these arguments out, I think we need to be much more proscriptive and proactive in talking to the governments of these developing countries, sort of explaining some of the options.
Just to answer my first question, did you find out anything in your research from the European history that showed how it got off track?
The best response I've seen is that in the mid-90s, when this technology was coming out, Europe was still flush under the cap system with ag subsidies. And so farmers within Europe didn't have to demand access to the best technologies, whereas we had started to cut our subsidies in the early 90s in Canada and the States. And so farmers said, okay, well, we're losing some of our subsidies. We need to be as efficient and technologically as advanced as we possibly can be. European farmers still had the luxury of all these production subsidies. They didn't need the technology to make a good return per acre. And so by the time their subsidies started to tighten up 10, 12 years ago, it was too late. They'd lost control of the technology to the environmentalists.
Final question.
Stuart, really enjoyed your talk, and you maybe partially just answered my question. So in addition to the political and sociological forces that you talked about that underpin the EU's obstructionist policies, is some of it just bald economics of inhibiting competition with the major GM exporting countries like the US and Canada?
That's a good question, because Europe's still food insecure. I mean, what they've done is they've pushed the fact that they don't want GM crops onto developing countries where we have some of the most biosensitive environments in the world. So they're importing all their GM soybeans from Brazil to feed their livestock because they won't grow GM soybeans in Europe. Well, when it comes to the management of the rainforest and protection of the rainforest, does it make, to me, I've got a big ethical problem with European NGOs saying, oh, it's fine for us to cut down more forest in Brazil to grow soybeans, as long as we don't have to grow GM soybeans in France or Germany. I think it's really a political dilemma that they're going to have to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Let me make 2 quick concluding comments, and then I think Morris wants to say something. The emergence and use of new technology is about finding feasible pathways. Clearly, the biotech GM revolution tripped into some back quarters and found difficulties in getting there. And I think what we've heard from our speakers is part of it starts at the industrial scientific level of how you construct and design and manage the evolution of the technology. But part of it similarly is the creation and management and cultivation of robust, responsive public systems that can make choices that are better for us than ones that aren't. And this isn't just an erudite conversation. Some of you may be part of the same listservs I am. There apparently was an attempt on the life of one of the EFSA GMO analysts earlier, I think it was last week, and so by a mail bomb. So these are things that people are projecting into the public space in ways that are not normal for the scientific dialogue and discussion that we're all part of. So I think it's an important issue. It won't end today, but I think we had an excellent presentation from our two speakers and from those who wanted to discuss it. So on that, I'd like to thank both speakers.
And just a couple of notes. One is to say thank you for the sponsor of the last session, which is the Canadian Canola Growers Association. And secondly, local food security. We're going to have lunch in a minute. Thank you very much to Nestle for providing us with lunch today. Thank you.